having me. Yeah, I change the title of almost every talk I do. I can't help but fiddle until the last minute. Anyway, it's amazing to be here. Obviously, speaking in Track A is an honor and beyond intimidating, so I'm really pleased to get a chance to try it today. I'm going to talk about a project that I did with Trulia. It was sort of a broad project. They'd realized that their UI had gotten a bit out of control. And luckily, they agreed to let me actually talk to you guys and even show you some cool, yummy data today. So I'm pretty excited about that. We did a project where we sort of reinvented what a style guide meant for them, a sort of modern version of what that could be. And at the same time, refactored their app to use more efficient HTML and to move them over to using Sass, or rather SCSS for the particular flavor that they chose. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about how we how we were able to use style guides as a way to improve their performance and to get some other good benefits that I think they really liked. So first I have to go back and talk about what style guides used to mean. And so this is an example of a style guide that was done for AOL in 2007. The thing is a beast. It's beautiful, it's amazing, it's gorgeous, it's like a piece of art, but I would say not really that useful for the web. So it has things like this with very detailed diagrams of their logo and exactly the amount of space that's supposed to be between each of the triangles and the actual text of the logo, and how much space should be above and below the logo, and all kinds of things that do not matter when you're making a website at all, because most of those decisions are made long before we ever get involved, right? It also contains really super useful stuff like how the logo should be positioned on a hat. Or their warm and cool palettes, which, it's beautiful. Look at that, right? Somebody spent a fair bit of time actually making that. But what that doesn't tell me is that top left yellow, am I supposed to use it for type? Or is it meant only to be a background color? Or is it the color of a box or a gradient? It's beautiful, but in the web world, I think not so useful. Also, it's fantastic that the Thesis font family is warm and intuitive, but I don't care. I just need to know when I'm trying to put something together in the app, what font I'm supposed to use and where, and how to make those decisions without having to go knocking on the designer's door every 2 minutes to ask them another question about how the thing was supposed to be built. So what I think about why these sorts of style guides don't work is because they take months to produce. They're basically out of date before they're ever PDF'd and put on people's desks, because this is how this kind of beautiful thing is meant to be used, right? It's meant to be delivered to you like a present or something. And I don't think that works, right? Because design is fluid. I mean, I can't tell you, maybe people can show me by a raise of hands, the number of times that a designer has said, this is the final design. It's never going to change after this, right? And then a week later, someone's like, well, that radius could be a little bit different. And so I think that we need a more fluid and more living kind of a style guide. We need something that works with code. And the other issue with them is that they're really designer-centric. It's useful for design to talk about what design means at AOL, but it's not useful for their web team or their engineers to be a part of the equation at all. So in my opinion, we have to kill that kind of style guide and that vision of a style guide, because it's stopping us from using something that could be an amazingly useful tool, but isn't because it's too limited by what it's been in the past. So we believe in creating living style guides, which are a little bit different. First of all, they're a guide to existing styles. They're not some pie in the sky, wouldn't it be lovely if our styles were all like this? They're a guide to what really exists on the site at that moment. And that's important, because that's the only way that you can start to iterate, is if you actually know where you're at now. It also lives in code, so it evolves with the site or app. This is super important. If you have a PDF style guide, it can't evolve. The site is constantly changing and responding to new constraints, or your app is adding new features, and something that doesn't live in code isn't going to keep up to date. So in my opinion, it even needs to use the exact same partials that you're using to build out your site, need to be used to build your style guide. That way there's no extra step in keeping things going. I also think it needs to be a collaboration tool for design and engineering to have better conversations, because it feels like a lot of times we're sort of butting heads, where one side blames the other and the other side blames the other, and it turns out that in terms of the performance equation, it's actually a little bit of everybody's fault. So I think a good style guide leads to better UI layer code, more informed design choices, and a better performing site, which may sound like a stretch, but I'm going to show you some examples of how that worked at Trulia. So Trulia was the ideal kind of client to work with on something like this, mainly because they were motivated to switch to SaaS, smart engineers, really excited about the project, so that always makes it easier. But also they had a ton of technical debt. You know, like a lot of companies, I feel like there's this kind of like a successful company thing. You get to a certain point where you have to actually deal with all the technical debt you acquired to actually achieve that success. And that's sort of an ideal candidate for looking at a style guide and looking at a UI refactor and looking at performance issues, because they have so much to gain from it. Not only in terms of the actual user experience, but honestly, on a site with a ton of legacy, it just stinks to be a developer, right? You're not having a lot of fun working with that. So this is an example that one of their engineering managers sent me when we were first talking about the project, about why they wanted to get involved in it. And I know it's really tiny. Sorry, I just have a PNG of it. But it says, "I've got the blues." And the reason it says that is because every single blue on that page is actually a subtly different hex value. So what Trulia chose to do is to convert their SRP, their search results page, mainly because it was already slated for a redesign, so it was sort of a good candidate to start off building the style guide. And I'm kind of going to jump to the conclusion first, so you know why you should care, because I think that matters. The first thing is to think about real user measurements. So if you get any takeaway from what I'm talking about today and decide to try a style guide, I would say first thing first, you have to have a sense of what matters to your users and what matters, you know, what is the thing you're trying to improve so you can tell if you actually got there or not. So Trulia has a bunch of metrics that matter to them, but you know, like Facebook's metric is how closely your social network on Facebook matches your social network in real life. Like that's excellent, right? Because that really fits for their business. But for everybody, it's going to be different. It's not going to be the same thing. So Trulia found that their new HTML was about 48% smaller than it had been before we used a style guide. They had a 21% faster load time. This one I'm particularly happy with, 60% faster time to first byte. You know, it's the worst possible user experience when they're sort of waiting for things to happen and they have that blank screen with nothing going on. So a 60% improvement in first byte really made me happy. They were also able to reduce their unused CSS by about 135 KB, right? So that's more than a site's worth of CSS that wasn't even being used at all. In terms of their results, their search results page views went up by about 11%. So that's huge, right? Imagine the product manager who you could say, like, I have this new fancy feature, and if we do it, the page views will go up by 11%. They'd be like, me, right? But if you tell them it's a feature that's going to be invisible and that if we do our job right, no one will ever see that it ever happened, then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, kind of skeptical, right? But I think it's really important to remember that performance is a feature, and when we do things that improve performance, particularly in the UI layer, we get really good user benefit, and it behaves like a new feature. I found this one interesting too. This is actually their property detail page, and their page views went up by about 3%. What's interesting there is we didn't touch that page. It just happens to be in the flow to get from the search results page, right? So even if you can just fix your top 3 pages in your site, you can still get across the board improvement in performance. Trulia also cares about some other things, click-throughs, leads, customer satisfaction, and stuff like that. And that's going to be different for everyone, what you care about and what you don't. But every single one of those metrics actually bumped up after we started refactoring their site and implementing a style guide. So you might kind of wonder, what does a style guide really have to do with this? I think the important thing is that CSS actually is responsible for a ton of performance issues. It blocks progressive rendering. That's your blank white page until finally everything shows up. It pulls in a ton of background images, and if you've ever looked at a water flow, you'll see that a good chunk of what's happening on the web is actually images. And content images aside, that's a little bit different. Like, that's a decision about, you know, where you want your product to be or something like that. That's probably not my domain. But if it's background images, that's something where you can really make a big improvement. CSS also correlates directly to render speed. And it's going to slow down your JavaScript, and not necessarily in a way that you can be like, that piece of CSS that slowed down my JavaScript, but more in a way where, like, you click on something and it's just not instantaneous. You know, it's like a I don't know, just sluggish, I guess. It also can cause janky scrolling and animations. And that can be important too, because there's nothing worse than something that's supposed to slide smoothly and actually jitters its way across the screen. So a style guide can really help with this. What we want to have is this. Like, imagine we needed to have a rubber ducky component in our app, and this was exactly what we needed. We needed a blue-eyed, orange-beaked rubber ducky. This makes a lot of sense, but what we often have is much more like this, right? We have proliferation of rubber ducky components until we end up having something that just doesn't really make sense. So the first thing to do, and I've talked about this before, so I'm going to go over it pretty quickly, but feel free to see me afterwards if it's something you haven't heard about before, and I'll get more into it. But the first thing you need to do is know what kind of duplication you have, because that's going to be your clues for what missing abstractions you need, right? Everywhere that you find that your CSS is growing larger accidentally means, oh crap, there's an abstraction that's needed here that people don't have, so they're writing it over and over. You can use grep. CSS lint has a secondary branch that'll do some duplication stuff, or there's a new Ruby gem out called CSS, which is a good way of figuring out what your duplication was. For Trulia, we used grep. It's easy. It allowed us to include like all sort of the most crufty CSS, because the more you put in, the better you'll get a sense of what kind of bad duplication you have and where your abstractions are missing. So we grep for various selectors, properties, and values, and a bunch of other stuff. We also don't worry about it being perfect. We just think about orders of magnitude. So this is roughly what we're doing. We're concatenating all the CSS together, and then we're running a very simple grep command. Now you can imagine that you could replace font size with some fancy regex that was going to make sure that there wasn't font size in a selector name or something like that. I wouldn't bother. I don't think it actually matters. If you match, a few extra elements than you should have, if a hex value looks like an ID, it honestly doesn't matter. It's an orders of magnitude thing. So here's some of the data that Trulia let me share, and just super, super cool that they did. Take a look at the margin and padding declarations. So they've got 3,993 margin declarations and 4,493 padding declarations. That's so high, right? But that's actually fairly typical for what we find when we start digging into a UI that's been in existence for a few years. And I see a few of you shaking your heads, but I would say go grep your own style sheets before you judge. You might be surprised at what you find. Again, headings too, and font sizes. Like those numbers, they're high, but they're just so much higher than they need to be to make a good UI layer that's easy to work with. Another one that I always grep for is pound important, right? Because this is like, I don't know, it's like the canary in the mine, right? The number of importance that you have is basically like people are getting to the point where they can't get done what they need to get done, and so they're like, I'll just throw that in there and we'll see what happens. Trulia had about 500 importance, and that said to me, like, this is the moment, we have to refactor this now. It shouldn't wait even 6 months. Yeah, and so there's some other numbers, and I'll post my slides later so you can check out the details. So the other thing that we look for is not just code duplication, but design inconsistency. Often there'll be, hundreds. I mean, for typography, it'll be like 300 or 400 different ways of having text treatments on the page. There's no way to build that efficiently in code if you're given designs that have that many variations. So we actually built a typography tool that allows us to find those variations. And I'm going to try Command F1 and see if that works. So we built a tool, and it's right now a Firebug extension, though we're definitely going to move it over to Chrome. So we go into the Trulia webpage and we click persist so that we can do several pages, because this is, again, the kind of thing where you're going to want to have a lot of data, not a little, because it helps make decisions. Then you click generate report. And it's going to show you, I know it's really small, sorry about that, but all this stuff in the middle doesn't matter at all. On the right-hand side, it shows you the actual font and the wording that was found. And then in the left-hand column, it's going to show you a count for how many times that was found. And then if I do a search and get to the search results page, I can generate the report again. And then, we would do it for multiple pages if we were doing it on an actual site. What's really cool about it is that, I've had a lot of conversations with designers that end up feeling kind of unproductive, where we're trying to say, okay, you can't have all of the typography, you have to pick some. It turns out if you put 5 designers in a room and you say, do you want 13 pixels or 14 pixel font size? They could debate that for like a day and a half, more. But if you say, do you want 13 pixels or 14 pixels, and you've used 13 pixels 1,400 times and you've used 14 pixels 23 times, all of a sudden there's data to back up those decisions. They don't have to make these amorphous, I mean, we wouldn't make decisions without data, right? So, but we can help them have the data that they need to make the decisions that they have to make. So that's something that's worked out well. Okay. And so the output of that is, a bunch of font sizes with their counts, and really super useful for making decisions. We also break it down by color in their counts. You could spend days debating which is the exact right shade of blue, but when you see that one of them was used 1,300 times and the other's just a handful, all of a sudden the blue decision is quick like that, right? So that's where we're trying to go. And you know what? Even if they decide that they actually are trying to move towards something that isn't where the site is at now, so they're saying, well, maybe we want that bright blue, even though it's the least used now because that's where our design is going. Then in the engineering side, you have an exact map of every time I find these 5 blues, I should replace it with this blue. And you don't have to have that back and forth discussion with design every single time you're trying to make an improvement to the performance. So we basically use some heuristics and some common sense to break it down and give them a list of the different topography they need. And this is simplified. Obviously, this is going to be for all the different components of the site. But they get that and they can use that. We also do it for buttons. And so this is all the buttons that we found on the Trulia site, right? Which is really, really a lot. Like, that it's just way too many shades of yellow and green and blue, and it's like every product manager just decided that they were going to do their very own thing, and luckily nobody made anything blink or magenta, but it was pretty close. So for each of those, we basically sit with design and have them make some decisions. For each thing, they can choose to build it, they can choose to replace it with something they've already decided to build, or as a very distant third, they can choose to redesign that thing. We try not to choose the redesign option because it's far better to say, let's just build it how it is now, and then we can iterate with something real, rather than have like long drawn out design discussions about where the meaning of the button is, that kind of thing. So you want to do this for all different component types. And when you'll have something like this style guide. So this is, oops. There we go. So this is the Trulia style guide that we built, and so you'll see it's got all the different kinds of topography. It gives an example of exactly what you'd need to put in the code in order to achieve that look and feel. And so it becomes like little Lego, right? You're grabbing one of these and you're combining it with one of those, and you put it all inside of a box like that, and you can build whole different UIs that nobody planned on just by using these existing little pieces of functionality. So if I click on buttons, you'll see that they were able to simplify down to, and at the top we tend to list all the different class names so that it's real clear to everybody what every piece of the UI is for. And so then you'll see they were able to simplify down just into a primary button, a default button, and then this sort of reddish danger button for delete and things like that. So just by making these kinds of decisions, they were able to really make it work better for them. And you'll see there are tons of different component types, including like white space classes and tabs and toggles and all the normal stuff that websites are made out of. One important thing to keep in mind, though, is that you want to separate out the code that's for making your button have buttonness, which is, solving all the IE bugs, removing all the weird styling that you're going to have on buttons by default, and put that into one class. And then anything that makes it red or orange or whatever, you want to put into another class. It's sort of a worst case scenario where you've stuffed all that into one class, and then every time you make a new kind of button, you're having to say, yeah, but it's not like that. Yeah, but it's not like that. That's a lot of work and will lead to pretty inefficient code. Okay, cool. So that said, how do we build a component? What's part of a component? How's that going to work? We have a specific component structure, and part of the reason why we have it this way is because we want to break the dependency of styles on views. Basically, when you tie together... Ooh. What did I do? So basically, when you have your styles dependent on your views, there's no way for your CSS to be efficient at all. So we kind of try to break that link. So what we have is a components directory, and inside of that, we're going to have all the different kind of components: boxes and form pieces and grids and lists and links and everything separated out. That way, if later one of those turns out to be unnecessary, it's super simple because it's very self-contained and everything you need to make a component is right there. We also found we'd like to have smaller files, and I have to admit I went kicking and screaming to this because I kind of like to have everything all in one place and just kind of keep it all in my head. And then my team grew, and I realized that's ridiculous, and we had crazy merge conflicts. And so breaking things out into smaller files made that a little bit easier. So this is a snippet from the box component, and you'll see that we have some SAS for it, and we have a small handlebars, which is just the partial to make a box. And then we have another handlebars, which is its documentation. And then we have a skin folder where we put in all those little like colors and borders and stuff like that. So keeping things a little bit organized. Some components are going to have associated JavaScript. A lot of them don't, but some will. And so we keep that in the component folder as well. We tend to have a component name .js and then just a small file, which is anything we need to initialize that particular component. Just trying to keep things clean. I think there are a few places where we've made mistakes, though. I don't love having all the skins be in separate files. Often they end up incredibly simple, so it feels like a lot of overhead to have those all be separate. On the other hand, if you're going to do some kind of fancy build process where you make sure stuff's being used before you build it into your style sheets, having it separate could be an advantage. So we basically, and this was a terrible idea, we have a giant JSON file that references all our components, and it's a huge pain in the butt to work with, and if a comma gets left out, it's not working very nicely. So we're going to find a better way to do this, which may just be smaller JSON files per component or something like that, but that's one part that I think we definitely haven't solved that well yet. We also import our component SAS files all into one larger one, though we do separate out stuff related to spriting because it's a bit slower. And we set up watchers to build everything automatically whenever the handlebars SAS or JavaScript are changed. That was just basically, it stinks to have to constantly be saving this and reloading things and all that kind of thing. So it saved us a bunch of time. You're probably pretty comfortable with watchers and build processes and templating, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. I don't think that would be as much of a value add as sort of talking about how we structure our SAS. And to begin with that, I need to tell you how I screwed it up to get started. So the first thing was trying to make a gray rounded corner box and sort of realizing that sometimes your SAS output is a lot larger than you might think that it is. That said, I love SAS. I wouldn't go back, and we were able to make these performance improvements using SAS on the site, but we did have to be sort of constantly vigilant and checking the output and making sure that SAS wasn't outputting something crazy because we'd combined things we didn't realize. So a box is going to need a clear fix, right? Because you don't want, if something's floated inside the box, it to stick out the side, and you want it to trap margins and things like that. So we need both clear fix and actually a new formatting context. So let's think about what includes. This is an example of a mix-in to include overflow clear fix, and this is the overflow hidden, overflow visible zoom one. There are a ton of different ways to do clear fix. This is just one of them. And so then I can say below in my cool thing @include clearfix overflow. And I'm automatically going to get all those property value pairs from clearfix copied down into my cool thing. Now, I think you can imagine how this goes awry when you have my cool thing 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you end up copying those property value pairs kind of all over the place. Especially in big teams, especially when it's not all next to each other like that, it definitely happens that we end up with a lot of sort of property value pair duplication. And it doesn't mean, sometimes that's still going to be the right choice. It's just about sort of being aware of it and making sure that it's the right trade-off in terms of file size and maintainability. Next up, I want to talk about making tabs and how I definitely screwed up making tabs. So in the OOCSS world, tabs are just a kind of box. And so I would just say tabs add extend box in Sass language in order to get all the sort of box goodness without having to rewrite that. And then I started writing the code specifically for tabs, and I went a little bit nuts. It feels so good to make your Sass match your HTML exactly. I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome. Which is ridiculous because I'm the queen of teeny tiny selectors, right? But look what this outputted, it's terrible, right? So I saw this and I'm like, ow, wow, right? Because, you know, there's only one A inside of, that's basically making a tab. I didn't need to say box head, tab control, LIA. Like, that's such overkill. That's not the selector that we need at all. But for some reason, writing Sass, at least for me, it felt really, really good to do this. So I have to sort of constantly watch myself and keep the result file open in another window so that I'm aware of my sort of bad habits. Another thing to notice is that Sass will output your line numbers and the file that it came from, which is super helpful for debugging. As well, in the Chrome DevTools, you can actually get it to follow back the chain and give you the actual Sass file, which is really useful. So yeah, super tempting to make the Sass match your HTML. Don't do it. It's a really bad idea. The Sass community came up with something called the inception rule, and that is to never go more than 3 levels deep. And I think this is a pretty good rule. I would say 2 to 3 levels deep is probably as far as you want to go in most cases. But yeah, I think that's a helpful rule. So how do we use Sass and also have good architecture? The first thing is to build simple components first. You're going to use those simple components when you're making the more complex ones. So people often want to like jump in and like build tabs and accordions and all kinds of more complex UI stuff, but it's better to save that until later. We start with something like this. It's a variables file, and we look at it as kind of a configuration file for our Sass. Now, you'll see warning, 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 never use this in your code. This is because we do 2 layers of Sass variables. I don't like the idea of using like a $blue class throughout all of my Sass because, like I said, final, final, final design never seems to actually be the final design. But we still liked the power of getting to have these names which described exactly what we were getting out of it. So we decided to do a 2-tiered approach to Sass variables. The first one is this, where we define all the basic colors and give them color names that match exactly what they do. But rather than using these inside the components themselves, what we do is create this next level. So this is for links. And we have link color, and that would be $blue. And we have link hover color, and that would be $green. And that allows us to basically have the nice, easy, readable thing and the consistency, right? Because we know we're not going to have a hex value in there that's slightly different. But it doesn't pepper our style sheets with variable names that are incredibly likely to change later. So we do that for a bunch of different typography. And we're using all the data that we're getting out of the component finder typography tool to end up building that. So we do something like this where we have, you know, our H3 and we're going to include font size of 24 pixels. One thing we found is that we're really loving working with rems, but it's a pain, to be perfectly honest. I don't want to be constantly thinking and calculating and not knowing what I'm getting out of it. And so a girl who I work with, Moby Whale on Twitter, actually created these mixins, which have been really helpful for us. It's a font size mixin and a calculate rem mixin. This means that we can just input pixel values and it outputs the most modern version that we can with a pixel fallback. And so we found that this is super helpful. Basically, in the code, you say @include font size of 16 pixels, and that's going to both output 16 pixels as a backup value and output the rem value for better browsers that can support it. So we do that for all different kinds of things. I think at first we've sort of focused on colors and stuff like that, but more and more we're pulling different things out of our files and putting it into variables. And it ends up feeling like it ends up feeling like a big configuration file where you can get things to turn out without making very many changes. And in fact, I think one of the things the Trulia designers really liked about it is that they saw this variable file and felt like they could really dig in. And you know, they're like, wait, I'm going to change the color gray, and started actually submitting pull requests, which is awesome, right? Because there's no reason to use engineering resources for, you know, a change in a color gray. But if they'd had to dig into the deep components in order to do that, they might not have felt like they could. So that was pretty awesome. So we also do things like declare the base line height and base font size, base font family, things like that. And those can be used by other components later that want to be, you know, doing vertical rhythm and stuff like that. So we do it for lists as well. Lists are super important, and they're like, you end up having more lists than pretty much anything else on your site. And so yeah, like that list up there, homes for sale, it's got a little gray line in between the items. That list is on almost every site in the universe, right? It's just the color gray of the line will vary. So there's a lot of this stuff. I kind of feel like about 80% of all apps and sites are the same, and then there's like a thin little layer, which is actually what makes them look different. So we do it for links as well, so they ended up with default links and low light links and forward links and back links. And now they have those, and they can plug them in different places and make stuff out of them without needing to reinvent the wheel and recode their link color everywhere. So we have a little teeny tiny handlebars file per component that just basically applies the class names of all the different skins so that it can output properly to the library. And then we're going to, again, have variables for links so that later, if we want to change them, there's no need to like really dig into the component. We also found that it helped to build 3 different layout mechanisms. One wasn't enough, and I think a lot of people will be like, oh, do you like grids or do you like inline? And I say, I actually think you need both in different contexts. So we built grids, a 24-based system. This is super useful. Like if you have a lot of floats and positioning and widths in your CSS when you go and grep it, that means that you need a grid system, probably rather badly. And so having a grid system means that people who don't necessarily understand every in and out of CSS layout can start making new cool pages without having to get exactly how every bit of CSS works. So the way that we did that, oh shoot, it's getting cut off at the top, but I'll tell you about it. We created a grid where you can input the number of columns that you want, because we found that from site to site it actually varied. And some people were okay with 12, but a lot actually needed 24. We had one request for 61, but I said no, because it's divisible by approximately nothing. So yeah, the number of columns you're going to have is going to vary. And so this takes 2 parameters, number of columns and your gutter size. And so those are things that you can basically output any grid system you want. And those, again, are in variables so that you can change them without needing to muck into the guts of how that component is working. Finally, we also have a media block, which lets you lay out images with text, and an inline list that lets you lay out things when you need vertical alignment. And so with those 3 pieces of layout, you hardly ever have to write any more floats again. The biggest thing with style guides is that you're making it easier to do the right thing than it is to do the wrong thing. People are always going to have a tendency to go back to views-based CSS anytime they can, because it's the comfortable path. It's how we've been doing it for a long time. But having a style guide helps break that connection between your view and your button, so that your button can live in a modal, or it can live in a page, or really anywhere that you need it to. So the takeaways are that clearly this was a group effort. A lot of things changed to make these metrics move. Design, style guide, Sass, UI layer improvements, as well as a bit of server-side cleanup. And I think the other takeaway is that Sass really can be made to be performant. We just have to be super vigilant about what the output is going to be like and make sure it makes sense to be sending that over the wire. And finally, good performance is a feature. If you can get an 11% page views bump from just a page that's changed performance-wise, I think that that's well worth taking to a product manager and having a conversation about. All of the code that I talked about is available on GitHub. It's under OOCSS under my username Stubbornella, and I will tweet and post the slides so that you can get that URL later. Thank you very much.